wanted to welcome you all to the 19th Roundtable of the Bonner Milltown History Center. We've had them on a variety of topics about the mill and the community, and we're excited to have this one today on where the mill got its wood from, looking at three of the four owners of the mill. The Hammond, who was, of course, A.B. Hammond, who was, of course, the first owner, he's going to have a special program on him in April 19th, a roundtable here. But today we're going to talk about Anaconda, Champion, and Stimson. The Bonner Milltown History Center is just down the street. If you haven't visited there, we encourage you to come and stop by. We have a little museum and lots of information, and we have Jim Willis has coffee on Tuesday mornings at 9, and we're also open on Wednesday and Thursday afternoons from 2 to 4:30. I want to thank St. Anne's and Father Poole for having us here at the church. It's a great space, as you can see, and we're grateful that they shared it with us. And thank MCAT for taping the program for us. That will be available as a DVD probably in 3 or 4 weeks, a month. And the important thing I should tell you before we begin is that if you need the restrooms, they're behind this panel here. So, and we're going to, as I said, have 3 separate discussions today, and we'd originally thought that we would do questions after each one, but we decided because the Lutheran church next door is installing their pastor at 3 o'clock that we would have the 3 presentations and then have questions. So there'll be a short little break when anybody who wants to go to the installation of the new pastor can leave. So we're going to start with a discussion of Anaconda, and I'm going to introduce Bob Lamley, and then he's going to introduce our other 2 speakers. Bob is a retired forester who started working for Anaconda in 1953, and he retired from Champion International Corporation in 1992. And at that time his title was General Manager of the Montana Region Timberlands, which included 870,000 acres of timberland, and I'm going to let him explain what that entails.
Okay. So, Bob. First of all, I want to say that the Bonner History Roundtable, we want to try to present what really happened getting the logs into the Bonner Mill. And we have to do this in 3 segments because we want to travel from, I'm going to go back to about 1950 when I originally came on. There was a management plan started. So we'll do the Anaconda area from 1950 to 1972, and then Champion took over in 1972 and sold to Plum Creek Timberlands in 1993. Stimson at that time bought the mill in 1993, and they run that mill till in what was 2008. So this is what we're going to do. You know, now the main responsibility that we had to provide the logs to those mills, and they had to be the right size and the right species, and sometimes that got to be quite a chore. But nonetheless, that was our main responsibility. We had other duties as far as managing the timberlands, but that was the #1 priority. And I'd like to start by taking us back a little bit in time. Am I talking loud enough in the speaker? Is that okay? In 1896, Anaconda acquired George Hammond's interest in the Bonner Mill, known as the Big Blackfoot Milling Company. Now that's what Miney mentioned, that there will be a discussion about their ownership later on. And in 1899, Marcus Daly purchased some 3 million acres of timberlands from the Burlington Northern, then, not the NP, and those were land grant lands that were awarded to the railroad to finance the construction in the west. They were given sections, alternate sections, 20 miles on each side of the railroad. And sometimes those grants had been taken up by homesteaders, etc. And so they were granted lands a little farther from as you can see, here's where the railroad went through, where we had lands clear up into this area up here. So, in 1950, timber management plan was performed on our timberlands. At that time, we had 650,000 acres of timberlands that were assigned to the Bonner Mill. And that was out of the original 1 million acres that were originally assigned to this area. Now you think of 650,000 acres, think of a section of land which is a mile square, has 640 acres in it. So if you divide that into 650,000 acres, we're talking about 1,000 sections of timberlands. And on this map, each one of these squares is a section. It's a half inch to a mile. However, not all of the land was in full sections. They were in partials. And so it amounted to having land in 1,546 sections that were assigned to the mill. So that shows all of the different ones. Prior to 1950, some of the land was sold after the logging. Also in 1945, 250,000 acres of timberlands were sold to J. Neal's Lumber Company in Libby, Montana. And that was areas up here, when you come up the Thompson River, be up towards this area over in here, up into Libby, and what is called the Fisher River. And those timberlands had not been harvested. There was no logging required on them, except maybe some salvage logging. And then later on, I think it was in the 20s, they donated some 21,000 acres of land to the Lubrick Forest. And that's this area here, this big blue area up the Blackfoot. And it was expanded, I think, almost to 4,000 acres by other donations, such as I think even the Northern Pacific donated some lands to that. Now these lands were managed by the Land Department, which out of the water operations, which was later known as Timberlands, which Tony had explained, and then under the direction of the land manager, and he reported directly to the general manager at Bonner. So we, as the land department, was known, we worked directly for the mill manager. And in 1951, the land manager appointed a forester to be the forest and logging manager to implement this timber management plan that I mentioned earlier. Logging in the timberlands was performed by two different types of loggers. The company equipment, or company loggers, they logged a lot up in the Blackfoot at this time, and the company bought the equipment. The employees were actually on the payroll at the Bonner Mill. Then the other part of the logging was independent contractors, and these were both small and large contractors. We had a lot of small contractors that went around and salvage logged in our areas, picking up dead and down timber and some of the bug kill timber at that time. We didn't have near as many bug kill trees as we have today. Also in 1951, construction started on the Thompson River Road. This is down by Thompson Falls, and it progressed up through here, clear up to the upper end. Well, this is Pleasant Valley, which I'll refer to. And it was some 75 miles long, cost $22,000 a mile. It was quite, but it really accessed large tracts of land, so that was the future supply for the sawmills when that was developed. Up until about 1958, the land department operated strictly out of Bonner, and we would leave Bonner and go up to all directions to our timberlands. The foresters all worked right strictly out of Bonner. So in 1958, they decided to make 3 districts, and these districts were named the Thompson River District, this one, and then The other one was the Blackfoot district, which is the upper above Bonner, all the Blackfoot. And then the other one was included all the Clarks Fork district, both east and west of Missoula. So you had the Blackfoot and the upper Blackfoot, the Clarks Fork on both sides of the Missoula, and the Thompson River up from Thompson Falls up to the upper end really was just west of Kalispell, I think I would say best. Okay. Now there was a district forester in charge of each one of these districts, and he's responsible for carrying out this forest management plan and the logging operations. I've got to find my paper here. Like I said earlier, supplying the mill with the right amount and type of logs needed for the Bonner operation was very important, the responsibility for the land department. We had a little change in the early days in the 50s, maybe the 60s, when the Butte mine started to go from underground mining into the big Berkeley pit. Then we kind of ceased making mine timbers, which was some timbers that were cut in the big sawmill, plus special framing timbers that were in there. So then the Bonner switched over and started cutting small logs strictly, and no more mine timbers. You know, prior to the management plan in 1950, a lot of the harvesting was done by what we call Sawyer's choice. And that was what the sawyers would pick the trees to cut. And the minimum tree at that time was supposed to be 14 inches diameter. Now that's about 44 inches around. So when you told a sawyer how big a tree, you told him what the circumference of the log was. And then it was to a 32-foot log to an 8-inch top. And this was what was the minimum tree that they were taking. So the sawyers did a real good job. There was, I have to say, there was some good and bad forestry as a result of those practices. Just like Lubrick Forest, most of the Lubrick Forest had been logged, and I think this had some really beautiful regrowth up there. But there was areas of the Lubrick Forest that was not logged at that time. Deep Creek out west of Missoula was the last of the Sawyer's choice. And they finished that up, I think, in about 1956. And that's, people have all heard of the Harper Bridge. That's where they brought the logs down across the river, and they had a railroad landing, even this close, and then shipped logs by rail in. Deep Creek, even age and uneven management was tried to be implemented on our timberlands at that time. And so we had different cutting methods. Some was called partial logging, tree selection, and others were regeneration type of logging. That was small clear-cut blocks or also seed trees that were left in the area to regenerate them. So we had two different types of logging, and I think Tony might cover some of this later on about what we call partial and regeneration type of cutting. So really the stand itself dictated what type of silvicultural system that we're going to put on the ground. After the inventory of the timberlands, it was established that the allowable cut would be about 126 million board feet per year. Now we talk about board feet. A board foot is 12 inches square, 1 inch is thick. That's a board foot. And so that was what we had to work with. Now if you look at board feet, we'll put it this way, that amounts to about 100 truckloads of logs during the logging season being cut to obtain that amount of wood. Also, at that time, the Bonner mills were using about 102 million a year, and you translate that in, and it's about 60 truckloads per year, or per day. In 1960, the Bonner mill started unloading logs in the recently built log yard. I think that was, they took part of the Victory Gardens, which probably a lot of people know about that. But anyway, they stopped dumping logs in the river, which is just above Bonner where that Fish and Game check station is at, where they have a landing. And so the trucks would come into the yard and be unloaded with a big Wagner loader. Now, we still had a lot of railroad landings. We had one in Fish Creek, Deep Creek, Plains, and the company had the Blanchard was a big loading areas where they hauled the logs into these landings and then they put them on railroad cars. So most of these operations, as far as loading the logs on the railroad cars, was tried to be placed near their logging operations so they had such a short haul. Eventually, these landings were all closed and they delivered the trucks by trucks to the Bonner yard. Also, in 1960, I think a lot of you remember when they modernized the mill out here, 60, 61. In order to finance that, we started selling some timber from our feed grounds, and we did that mostly up here in the Pleasant Valley, the farthest from the mill. And it was on our feed ground, and what we say, we're selling stumpage because we were advertising them and selling them in different mills like St. Regis, at that time, Jane Hills at that time, and then Plum Creek at Columbia Falls bought a lot of logs. And so it was our, what we call stumpage, and stumpage, that's the value of the standing timber on at a stand. And any trees that's valuable, we call it stumpage. Now, also, Anaconda owned some merchantable timber that was on what we call timber deeds. The company bought these timber deeds back at the Depression time, and most of them were up, that I dealt with, was up Pleasant Valley. And the rancher sold the timber, got money for the timber, paid his taxes, and survived during the Depression. And they were very thankful that this happened. And so when we came back 30 years later to log that, we had to determine whose logs were what. So we had what we call increment bore. We bore into the tree and get a core, count the rings. So these trees that might have been 14 inches are now 18 or 20 inches. So that was our tree. So that's how we established a volume and money to modernize the mill. In 1961, Anaconda changed from the Anaconda Lumber Department to the Montana Forest Products. In 1963, Anaconda announced the logging in Thompson River and shipping logs by rail to the recently built railroad landing. So all the logs from this area come down the Thompson River Road and to the landing here at Thompson Falls. I might be blocking some of you people there, but... And that was really an area where we could deck logs, store them, surge the mills with the species and sizes they need. It was a real relief area to keep track of the right amount of logs. After the forest management plan was developed, they developed a handbook. Now this is a book that tells all about our organization, how the different cutting methods we had, all the reports about cruising, anything else that we had to do. This was a book for the foresters to work by, and it had lots of information in it. And I gave this book to the History Center, and so it's out there for anybody who would like to see it, or anybody would like to look at it this afternoon. How am I doing? I'm about done, huh? One of the things that happened in the plans in that book, it showed the administration chart of the Forest and Logging Department. Timber management was an important part, but logging. Before we started the logging area, we had to decide which areas would need to be logged. We had to make sure we had the roads in, and then we had to run the property lines, and then the foresters came in and marked the timber. So that was a project that had to be performed before we could move to any place to go logging. Now, Anaconda maintained a land book, and that book was about that big a square. about that thick, and there was 5 of them. It had all the property that Marcus Daly had owned in this area. It showed all the sales of timberlands that went to the various ranchers, everything. It showed all the right-of-ways, etc. As I last heard that the books were down at the Russell Street office with Plum Creek, and I think they've taken back to Kalispell, but I'm not sure. But also, all the foresters had an ownership book. It's a book that each page was a township, 6 miles square. That one I opened up and happens to be McGregor Lake up west of Kalispell. And some of those maps were made by a man named Frank Vogel. They were made back between 1900 and 1907. And he followed the surveyors through and then drew the map on the interior part. He had the boundary lines, etc. And so that, you'd like to look at that book, it'll be up here to take a look at, but it's kind of interesting. Also on the side page, every section of land that was not Champion or NP or Anaconda, there was a number, and that number on the left-hand side said who the owner was. So you had an indication of a lot of landowner. It's kind of historical because we're talking about a long time ago, people that were in the ranches a long time ago. We maintain a forest inventory. We had log scaling, which is measuring the logs. We measured the logs as they went on the railroad cars. That was for payments to the loggers, credit to the company logging, and also the charge to the mill. We did a lot of work on roads with cost-sharing roads. We built roads that would go into various areas such as Thompson River, and it'd be NP and Forest Service and state. Then we paid for that road according to our ownership in that drainage. And so each party would pay 40%, 30%, 40% of the road costs. And then it was maintained, and all the ownership people could then use that road. It would not be fighting over right-of-way. We also were involved in some fire protection. The VFPA and the Northern Montana Forestry Association, they protected the timberlands on most of Anaconda's land because they were outside the national forest. So they protected lands and fought fires on those various areas. And then later on, I think it was 1971, the state took over all of those operations, and they fought the fires on this place. And then Anaconda, or Champion at that time then, we paid so much an acre to have the fire protection. Another area that was kind of funny was grazing. Well, after we started logging and had some of these areas regenerated or replanted and seeded logs, we wanted to keep the cows off of them so they wouldn't chew up all our... Well, now that was a job for a young forester going up and tell one of those old ranchers when he could turn out his cows and when he had to get them back and how many. So that was quite an interesting experience. I did a couple of nasty things. I said, well, these people up here in Pleasant Valley said if you don't want us grazing, fence it. I said, fine. I said, the people from down at Hot Springs would like to come up, and they said they'd fence it. Well, then they took out permits. So at that, I'd like to close and say that the forest and logging manager, he cooperated with other certain tax and land agencies in Anaconda Company and Ute for maintenance of the tax and land records pertaining to all the company timberlands. Certain forest and range lands of the Anaconda Reduction Department were administered by the forestry and logging manager. These lands were held primarily for watershed purposes with grazing and timber values considering secondary priorities. And so what we're saying is that our local manager, he had to manage these lands over Anaconda for a short while. After the sale, then they retained it and had a forester take care of it. I got a little mixed up with my sheets here, so I apologize for having to stall here a minute. I just wanted to close and say that in regard that we did manage to survive in that area. We didn't have personal cell phones, we didn't have computers, but we did have an antiquated radio system that we were able to communicate. So that was the end of us as Anaconda. And then I have to introduce now Tony Liane. He will handle the champion area. And Tony is a retired forester. He graduated from the University of Montana Forestry School. He was hired in 1977 by Champion and worked in several positions until Champion sold the Bonner operations to Plum Creek Timber Company. He was appointed manager of the Department of Natural Resource Southwest Land Office. He remained there until he retired in 2014. Tony Liane.
Well, thank you, Bob. You know, the Anaconda days were special to a lot of us people who followed in the Champion days because of the care that the foresters and the company took of that land. And so we really appreciated it. A whole bunch of young foresters came to work for the end of the Anaconda days and early Champion days. We were working for a bunch of old Anaconda foresters. They were probably in their late 30s or early 40s, and but they were old, and we learned a lot from them, and we continue to learn a lot from them all through our careers with Champion. And trying to figure out exactly how to go through the Champion days, had a hard time. I really couldn't go year by year because so much happened, and it all got mixed together. So I thought I would talk about the various major topics of the 21 years of Champion. It seemed like Champion was here forever, but it was really only 21 years. And but an awful lot happened in western Montana during those days. So Champion acquired, it was U.S. Plywood and Champion Paper that acquired the Anaconda Mill and Timberlands in 1972. One of the first things they did, Anaconda had an inventory, but they had pretty big plans, and they wanted to verify that the inventory was correct, or to validate that it was correct, to meet their future demands for wood. And so in 1972 and 73, almost every forester that worked for the Anaconda Company became Champion employees and started cruising timber. And they went on all of these lands and did a sample cruise of what the standing volume was. And I'm not sure, maybe Bob or Andy or somebody knows how close that came to the Anaconda inventory. But whatever it came out with, it must have indicated there was enough wood to build a plywood plant. And they built a plywood plant in 1972, 73, 74, that at the time, my understanding was it was the largest plywood mill in North America. And obviously, Bob talked about the old Bonner mill taking a little over 100 million board feet a year of logs. Well, that mill was still there, and now the addition of the largest plywood mill in North America. And you can imagine the amount of wood it was going to take to feed that mill. And not only did they come with building a new plywood plant, they also had two other mills that became the responsibility of the foresters working for the company at that time. One was at Silver City over by Helena, and the other was up in Browning. And so the foresters and the logging department became responsible for wooding those mills as well. Then in 1977, I got out of the Army in 1977 and came back to work for Champion. They acquired and merged with Horner Waldorf. And although we didn't have to provide wood for Horner Waldorf, they had an organization called Tree Farmers. And Tree Farmers had some mills. They had a mill in Missoula, they had a mill in Darby, they had a mill in the North Fork of the Salmon River, and at Salmon. And luckily, they had a forestry staff that came with. And so, adding these foresters and logging operations to the Champion operations, we started doing a lot of different things. Where the old Anaconda foresters and Champion foresters before '77 mainly dealt with fee land timber, now we had to start working with contract on Forest Service timber, state timber, BLM timber, and doing things in a little bit different way and covering a lot more country because we were all the way down in Salmon, Idaho, having to manage and operate timber sales. So in 1985 then, another change came. Champion International merged with St. Regis. And St. Regis had a plywood plant, a large sawmill at Libby. And again, luckily, they came with a forest management staff that knew their lands and knew their landowners up there and had contractors and were working with them, and they were brought into the Champion organization, and we became one big happy family in western Montana. At that time, we had a lot of foresters and forestry staff working for the company. And then as far as big changes, the old Bonner sawmill was closed in 1989, and the new stud mill was built and started operations in 1990. Every one of these changes required doing our forestry business a little bit differently. Different logs, different lengths of logs, different species and demand, various contracts with federal and state tribal contracts. And so we kept on having to change the way we were doing business and managing not only our own lands, but also providing the wood to meet the mill demands. To accomplish the logging, as Bob said, we had both company loggers. Most of those were, in the old days, were out of Twin Creeks. And then we had some contract logging. When we acquired or merged with Horner Waldorf, we also then acquired contract or company loggers that worked primarily in the Bitterroot. And they had been managed by a Tree Farmers organization. And then when we acquired, merged with St. Regis also had company loggers. And so the company had a large commitment to a large workforce that were logging company lands and then also logging the contract timber that we were buying. In 1985, for whatever reason, Bob would know, it was decided that we would do away with the company logging and go strictly to contract logging. And so in 1985, all of the logging equipment that the company owned from Libby or the Bitterroot or Twin Creeks was all brought down to the BFPA and then sold in an auction at that time. A lot of it was sold to old company loggers, and they became new contractors that worked for us. We guaranteed that we would give, if they bought the company equipment, we guaranteed that we would have contracts with them to log woods for the mills. We saw a great deal of change from 1972 until 1993 on how logging was done. When most of us started working for Champion, it was the same type of logging that was done in the Anaconda days. It was chainsaws and tractor crawler skidders with cables, dragging logs down to landings. We had some line machines, but it was all a ground-based logging operation. It took lots of people to produce the logs that the mills needed at that time. And then Ernie decided that we ought to get into helicopter logging, because there was a lot of ground that really we just couldn't build roads into. And so the first helicopter logging operation on company lands took place right across the river up behind West Riverside, and we landed the logs right in the East Log Yard from that helicopter sale. And after that we did several more helicopter logging operations. And then pretty soon they designed clippers that would go up to a tree, and big shears would shear that tree right off the stump. And then they had feller bunchers that would bunch logs as they clipped them and put them into big piles. We had grapple skidders. We had automatic delimbers, slide boom delimbers to take the limbs off the trees. And then we had single grip harvesters that would make the logs right out in the woods. And they had computers in them, and they manufactured the length of logs that was required, and then they put them on forwarders and hauled them back down to the landings. So the change in how we logged in that 21-year period was really pretty dramatic. And yes, we did have cell phones when we got done. We also, when we got into contract logging, decided it was most efficient in getting logs to the mills to have trucking contracts as well. And so we had a couple of contracts out of the Missoula area here and one in the Libby, Thompson River country, where we had contractors with people that just owned log trucks. And then they would go and work with them. We'd tell them, you're working with this logger, we want you to haul 8 loads a day from that logger. And the logger would produce the 8 loads, and the trucker would haul the 8 loads. And that way we knew and could depend on how much wood was coming into the mill. We had the 650,000 acres of fee land. When we merged with St. Regis, we got back the 250,000 acres that we sold J. Neal's back in the 40s. Now we have a little over 800,000 acres, a little less than 900,000 acres that we had to manage. But we were also, because of the size of the mills, the numbers of mills, we were actively buying Forest Service timber sales, both in Montana and Idaho, Bureau of Land Management sales, Bureau of Indian Affairs sales, and state sales. And then Gatewood. Ranchers would do their own logging, and they would bring in wood to the mill, and it would be scaled and purchased from these small landowners. And we also bought a lot of timber from Plum Creek. Plum Creek had a lot of lands that were closer to Bonner, and rather than haul them all the way up to Columbia Falls, they sold them to us, and we did vice versa. We sold logs up in the upper Thompson River, Pleasant Valley to Plum Creek for their mills. Next subject was reforestation. Anaconda was actively involved in reforestation. A lot of their efforts were in promoting natural regeneration after their logging operations, but they were also doing planting of bare rootstock. I started actually working for the Anaconda company in 1971 and 72, and at that time we were just starting to, we developed and built a greenhouse out of the VFPA, and we were doing testing and trials of containerized seedlings versus bare root seedlings. And there were various kinds of containers that we used to grow the individual trees in, and we'd take them out and plant them and see if they lived or grew or what they would do and how that compared to bare root seedlings. We collected our cones. We bought cones from anybody who would bring a bushel bag of cones, and we spent a lot of time collecting cones. And we don't know where they came from, usually. Maybe it was the Blackfoot, or maybe it was up Lolo Creek. We didn't quite weren't sure where they came from, but we bought them, and then we decided that we needed to process these cones, so we bought seed processing equipment from the Forest Service up at the Savanac Mill. We brought it down here to Bonner, and we set it up in one of the buildings, and I can't remember which building it was, but we get all these thousands of bushel bags of cones, and we'd load them up in ricks, and we'd haul them into the dry kilns and dry them. And at first we didn't know that you shouldn't fill the bags up full, so the first few batches, the bags broke and there was cones and seed everywhere. And then we would process the seed, take the wings off, and bag it all by species, and then have trees growing. We were also involved in that time at superior tree programs. And there was 4 main species, I think, that we were involved in. It was ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, western larch, and white pine. And we were out looking for what we considered to be superior trees. And a whole bunch of smart guys that get together and they decide which are the best of the best. And we would mark those, and then when they had cones on it, we'd go collect those cones and then process the seed. And we used that seed to develop several superior seed orchards. The closest one here is the ponderosa pine seed orchards on the state nursery. All those were part of that program, and there was one up in Plains, and there was some over in Idaho, and then we shared with the other partners in that seed and growing superior trees. Then we knew where the seed came from, not just from squirrel crash up Lolo Creek someplace. In 1989, Champion decided that we needed to grow our own seeds in a big way. And so they worked to find the right location, and they decided on Plains, Montana, at our office in Plains, and they built a bare root and a large greenhouse nursery. Then all the seed was processed up there. We grew the seedlings, both in bare root and containers, and then the trees went out to the feed lands and were planted. Did a lot of site preparation for those activities. I did a lot of mechanical scarification and burning scarification. And then we also got into chemical scarification with the use of helicopters to improve the survival and growth of the trees we planted. As I mentioned, Anaconda had an inventory, and Champion had an inventory in 72 and 73 to verify the Anaconda inventory. In 1977, they decided it was time to put in a very scientifically developed inventory system on all fee lands. They acquired colored aerial photography of all of our ownership, and foresters sat around and used that and mapped every stand type that was in each one of our sections, and they were mapped by dominant species and size class, stocking levels, and we did this all with stereoscopes and looking at aerial photography taken at a fairly good altitude. Acreages were developed for each stand. We used dot grids, and we sat for days on end with dot grids, counting dots in each stand and then calculating the acreage for that stand. It was tedious. We mapped all the existing roads on the company lands, and then we randomly located plots on the maps, and then we hired foresters, seasonal foresters, to go out and put those plots on the ground. And we measured for species and diameters and height and age, growth rates, log qualities, defect. We measured regeneration, seedling, saplings, pole size, kept track of all this information, and then put it into a computerized database, calculated the volumes, and with that information, we're able to determine what our allowable cut would be in the future. We collected information on thousands and thousands of trees. I think at one time we had about 14 seasonal foresters out doing plot work for us across the ownership. The organization, Bob said they had 3 districts, Thompson River, Missoula, and Blackfoot. The Champion had a bigger organization, needed more people to produce the wood. They divided those 3 districts into 6 districts. And it was the Plains District, McGregor Lake, Clark Fork, Hellgate, Potomac, and Lincoln districts. And then in 1976, these lands were officially separated, so to say, from the mills and became Champion Timberlands, a division of Champion International. Then after the St. Regis merger, we picked up 250,000 acres, and so we had those lands in Libby, and we changed into 2 areas. One was the Libby area and one was the Missoula area. And we had area managers for each one of those areas, and then later we became the Rocky Mountain operation. But it wasn't just foresters out in the woods with paint guns. We had planning, foresters in planning, we had foresters in inventory and nursery operations, log quality, sale administration, log procurement. We had foresters throughout all the organization. And it just wasn't foresters and loggers. We had accountants, we had people in human resources, we had the upper level management, and we had our support staff that kept everything running. And it was very critical to us. So forest management, we had 6 districts. Each district had about 100,000 acres. And we were told to produce the wood that was required, take care of our lands, and take care of our neighbors, and treat them with respect. In order to do that, and at that time, the loggers referred to us foresters as tree markers. That's all we were. How did we do that? Well, we had to know the land. I mean, 100,000 acres. At that time, I had management of all of those acres, about 100,000 acres. And to produce the wood, you really had to know that ground. And that took a lot of time and effort. And it took some stability in the workforce so the foresters knew the ground. We had to make sure we knew our ownership. As Bob mentioned, we had to survey. It was like looking for a treasure. We'd have 100-year-old survey notes that described a location of a section corner, and we had to go out and try and find that. And when we found it, it was exciting. It was a lot of fun. And then once we knew our ownership, where the property lines were, we had to determine, what timber was best suited for the mills at that time. And then we had to locate and build logging roads. It's surprising, even in the 70s and 80s, there was an awful lot of ground that did not have logging roads that met the needs of the equipment that we were using to do the logging at that time. And so we'd get our maps out and we would kind of figure out where we wanted roads to go. And then we'd go out in the ground and we'd flag those roads. And then we'd contract with a log builder, and they'd come out and build the roads. Some of them were on our ground, some of them weren't. It depends on how good our surveying was. Then we developed silvicultural prescriptions. And Bob talked about seed trees and shelter woods and clear cuts and selective harvesting. Some of them were regeneration cuts, some of them were maintaining an uneven age stand that had developed during the Anaconda days. Once we had those silvicultural prescriptions, and it was based on the species composition and stand conditions that we developed those plans. Then we had to mark the trees. That's where the tree markers came in. Had to write logging instructions, and we had to administer those logging contracts with either the company loggers or contract loggers, whatever the case may be. We had to plan for disposing of the slash. We had to plan for scarification to get the natural regeneration or for planting operations. And for planting, we had to plan about 2 years in advance because it took 2 years to grow a seedling for when we wanted to plant it. And so we had to plan that much in advance as to where we were going to plant trees, what species, tell a nursery what to develop for us. And all through this time, we tried to keep our neighbors informed of what we were doing, tried to listen to their concerns, and trying to address any issues they may have with what our logging plans may be. Champion and foresters were involved in right-of-way acquisition, land exchange, log quality, log yard inventories administration, chip inventories, chip contracts, and deliveries, mill studies, landowner assistance, and we even got into politics. Champion and foresters were involved in establishing the water quality best management practices for Montana foresters. We also got involved in developing the streamside management zone law. And then we helped our contractors learn how to apply these guidelines and rules. We got involved in establishing the smoke management program for Idaho and Montana to protect water quality. Lastly, the Champion was more than just a mill and lands and logging. They were also a part of the community of Missoula and Bonner and western Montana. And they did a lot of things that a lot of people probably didn't know or don't remember. The chain of lakes. Where are we, Bob? Up in here. The chain of lakes up McGregor Lake and Thompson Lakes. It's about 3,500 acres that was donated to the Nature Conservancy at the time, and then transferred to FWP and became the Chain Lake State Park. Placid Lake State Park was company ground that was donated to FWP as a state park. Salmon Lake State Park was donated to FWP, and it was in memory of 3 foresters who were killed in a plane crash in 1976. The Russell Gates Fishing Access Site was donated to FWP in memory of Russ Gates, who was killed in the logging accidents. And then there's the Corrick River Bend Fishing Access, and that wasn't in memory of Corrick because he was still alive at the time, but as more in honor of Ernie Corrick and all he had meant to forestry in western Montana. We also did land exchanges. Johns Root State Park was company land, and that was exchanged with FWP to create that state park. Harper's Bridge Fishing Access Site was company ground. There again was an exchange with FWP. Clearwater Game Range, we blocked up a lot of ownership so that it was more efficient for us to manage our lands with FWP on the game range. We're also very active in community affairs, United Way. We're very active in United Way and Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts of America. Donated a lot of historical documents to the museum at Fort Missoula. The donation to the Shea engine they used to sit across the street to the fort was done by Champion. And then Champion employees helped in developing the Forestry Interpretive Center out at Fort Missoula, and put a lot of time and effort into maintaining that historical evidence of logging in western Montana. So with that, over my time, Bob.
Very good. I forgot a lot of those things we had done. Didn't really realize that. Anyway, Tony got us to the end of the Champion era, which was sold in 1993. I retired in 92. I got out just before they sold us. However, the Plum Creek, they purchased all this land, and they also purchased the sawmills. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Andy Lukes. Andy is a retired forester, graduated from the University of Montana Forestry School. He was hired by Champion to be the planning manager, and that consisted of long-range planning and etc. that was going on. Champion got really involved in that, and Andy can tell you more about that. Later on, he was appointed to one of the district foresters that we have up there on the wall back there, and this was due after we had all those mergers. And then he went to work for Stimson Lumber Company. Plum Creek, when they bought the mills, and the Timberlands, they said they didn't want the mills, so they sold them to Stimson in 1993. And that's when Andy went to work for him. And then he retired in 2005. So Andy, I'll let you tell us about Stimson.
Thank you, Bob. I'll hit some of the high points. I know people have other things to do at 3, but first thing I'd start out with is a disclaimer that the personal views that Bob, Tony, and I express are not necessarily the views of Anaconda, Champion, Plum Creek, or Stimson, because we know this group can ask some pretty interesting questions. As Bob said, Stimson came into Missoula area in western Montana without much fanfare, and most people didn't know much about Stimson. I can recommend a book that tells the history of Stimson. It was a very unique, and is a very unique family-owned business. It's a privately owned family. 7 generations have been in the forest products industry. Started in Muskegon, Michigan in 1850, and they moved west. They moved into Chicago, Seattle, the area of Oregon around Portland, Forest Grove, Tillamook Burn, the Redwood Country, and what have you. All of that is in this book, The Builder's Spirit. The Bonner History Group has a copy of this book. If you do have one yourself, it's a very valuable book. You can check Amazon, and it surprises you. I was going to recommend people go ahead and buy it, but even a used copy is $135. And if it's new, it's $300. So, but it takes the history of the company there to 1983. There is also, and to save time, you can Google the reference for business and Stimson Lumber Company, and they'll give you a 5-page summary of the Stimson Lumber Company. Very private company that doesn't talk very much. Anyway, Bob covered quite a bit of what I was going to say about Stimson. The only reason, because Stimson only purchased about 2 mill sites, 1,200 acres, it had no timber. You can't run a mill without timber, okay, especially a mill the size of Bonner and Libby. And that's what this timber supply agreement that Stimson actually finally entered into with Plum Creek. This timber supply agreement, you can look at it as a timber sale, but it wasn't exactly a timber sale because it was for Plum Creek delivering the logs to Stimson's mills here in Bonner and Libby and ultimately a little into Idaho. It was for 1 billion board feet of timber. And this timber was to come off of the lands Champion sold, but also from Plum Creek lands that they couldn't afford, as Bob talked about moving timber around. You can't afford to get small logs near Phillipsburg and what have you up to Kalispell. So it was a agreement with a very large amount of timber, and that was the only reason Stimson was able to operate here. If Plum Creek had not sold the mills to Stimson, they would probably have been shut down. There were threats of antitrust problems because they would have ended up owning most of the timberlands in western Montana, plus they would have owned all the plywood mills in western Montana. So it was a mutually beneficial type of thing for both Stimson to come in, because their expertise was in buying wood, manufacturing wood, selling wood, running mills, and they had this 7-generation experience in doing it all over the West, but not in the Rocky Mountains. They ultimately did put a base together here. This timber supply agreement is kind of like a marriage, basically. You have to have a lot of trust. There's a lot of pluses in a marriage and a lot of minuses in a marriage, I think we can all relate to. The timber supply agreement was beneficial to both Stimson and Plum Creek. To give an idea of 1 billion board feet, that's about 250,000 truckloads of logs that had to be moved into milling facilities over a 10-year period, or maybe about 125 loads per day. So this was a tremendous amount of wood that had to be moved. Without this agreement, the Bonner Livy mills would have closed very, very quickly. But with this agreement, they managed to stay open. And here in Bonner, it was 14 years of employment and benefit there. It had a lot of benefits to Plum Creek, guaranteed income to pay off timberlands because of the nature of the agreement, which was very generous to pay Plum Creek, but it improved the delivery economics of Plum Creek. That was one of the big pluses. Stimson got the majority of wood to supply their mills here from the agreement, a chance to buy lands and to improve the mills themselves in the process and get a foot in the door, basically. As it was mentioned, the Bonner Mill was the world's largest plywood mill at the time it was built. It had a 10-foot lathe in the plywood plant and 3 8-foot lathes. Because of the wood, Stimson initially was operating 2 8-foot lathes there and the stud mill. And that was all that the deliveries would basically support. Stimson had the advantage there of an excellent skilled workforce, financially sound, because as a private company, they used their own money to do things, basically. They raised it, very, very astute in terms of how they did business. And they had probably some of the best sales and manufacturing expertise. They had an innovative product that they were able to capitalize here at Bonner, Duratem plywood. And that allowed profitability. The stud mill always struggled in Bonner here, mainly because the contract that was entered into for the stud mill required logs being paid for down to 4.6 inches on the small end, okay? And cutting studs and trying to get 2x6s out of that thing was very, very difficult. Plywood logs are basically 7.6 inches and larger on the small end. So this is a end on a plywood log, okay? So it was a real challenge and a struggle for the 14 years that Stimson was here to make the stud mill profitable. Those small logs that you see being delivered to the chipping operation on the Bonner site there's a tremendous amount of studs in that, those chippable material there. And it's one of the kind of a tragedy to see those things chipped up. It was Stimson's goal to try to establish a timber base here, and they set a goal of acquiring about 100,000 acres of land in Montana. Early on, they were forced to close the Libby Mill. The Libby Mill was a plywood plant that had one 8-foot lathe and then a 4-foot lathe. So the stud logs that were coming into Libby, they were cut up into 4-foot blocks, and they were used for cross plies and plywood. But Libby had the disadvantage of producing quality plywood, and quality plywood logs are hard to come by, especially when you have in the Kalispell, Columbia Falls area, Plum Creek needing the same kind of logs. So basically, tough go, but the bottom line is Stimson was able to establish, similar to the units that Bob and Tony talked about, the units that to manage the timberlands. Stimson had 3 foresters that handled the timberlands here that they had acquired in Montana. They had a log or sort of land purchasing agent here, and they did their best to establish a timber base to be able to supply the mill. Stimson and its employees fought the good fight to keep the Bonner Mill running, like I said, for 14 years. For unlike the federal government, forest products companies must operate in real world economics. They must make a profit to stay in business. They can't do virtually nothing in terms of active stand management, fire salvage, insect and disease on their commercial timberlands and call it good management. With that, I know we're a little over on time, so we'll entertain questions as a group here. So.
We answered all the questions, Bob.
Uh-oh. This one's for Bob Lamley. When you laid out the Thompson River Road, is that right?
Portions of it.
Portions of it?
The first 20 miles was built when I first went up there. Am I on okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
So about how many years of planning and how long did that take to build the Thompson River Road?
The original surveying started in 1951, and it was completed up through Pleasant Valley, which was what we call Haskell Pass, and that was about 75 miles, and that was probably completed in early 60s, 61 or 62. It was completed when we started that extra timber sales to supply the funds for the Bonner modernization.
Approximately 10 years then.
Pardon?
Approximately 10 years then.
Yeah, I would guess you're pretty close, yeah.
And did you build the Thompson River reload for the rail transfer simultaneously?
Yes, that was built, and that was the extra project, was separate from the original construction.
I have a what-if question, and I'm not sure if any of the three, I think, could probably take a crack at this, but let's just say it's a what-if in the sense, it's simplifying this, but what if Anaconda hadn't been bought out? It was just run as a traditional timber company, yet today. In other words, running it for a profit into perpetuity. What would it look like today? Would it still be around? And what might the composition of it be?
You know, I guess I would like to take a crack at that.
times changed. And as we all know, land became very valuable. And when the land the trees were growing on became more valuable than the trees themselves, companies started looking at the bottom line and how they could make money. And would there still be Anaconda forest lands? Maybe so, and maybe a mill of some sorts. But I think the land ownership would have changed. Champion International had a real estate division operating out of Texas or Florida or someplace. And they would send us a map and say, send us a deed for this piece of ground, send us a deed for that piece of ground. And we didn't have any choice. We sent them the deeds. And they sold the land. And so would it have stayed the same? Probably not.
Andy answered this already. I was curious about the ethics of professional foresters. Forestry grads ended up in state, federal, and company offices. Well, how do they actually communicate at coffee breaks and stuff? You said originally that they cooperated as much as they could back in the 70s. Then Andy answered my question that sustainable, healthy forest ethics went down the toilet, right? Yes, no, don't answer that.
Yeah, there was something said about company involvement in public affairs. We had Ernie Corrick was involved with all kinds of public affairs. He never did say no to anything they asked him, and then he would delegate that down to his staff. So Bob and I are all over the country here following Ernie Corrick's obligations. Public relations, right, Bob?
Yeah, the poor guys that were next to Ernie was ones that got caught when United Way called up and they want somebody to volunteer. Why, first one out the door, he grabbed Jim Bentley or myself, one or the other, and we had to go participate in some of these programs. But he was very generous with a lot of people and helping. And one of the things that the Montana Council, Bob Brewer over there, or myself, and Dan Larson from Libby, we had a council with Tucker Hill, who was a public relations man, and every year we'd meet and go over donations that we made to various football teams, softball teams, you name it. And there was all types of donations made, and it was really interesting, all the different things that Champion was involved in supporting. You want to add anything to that, Bob? Or did he leave? Oh, he had to leave early.
No, he's still there.
Yeah.
No, I would just say that the company was very, company being Champion in this case, was very generous. All the communities they were in, and of course the Missoula area being one of those. And I would just say one other thing, which you all should know, that when Champion sold the properties to Plum Creek, and Plum Creek told them they did not want to run the mills, Andy Ziegler said, we're going to run the mills, or we're not going to save the Timberlands. So you all need to know who worked in the mills that you were able to work because Champion insisted that those mills be operated. So that's why Plum Creek found Stimson to run those mills. But that's something that the management absolutely was adamant about when they did sell to Plum Creek.
I'm Ralph Smith from Topadeep, and somewhere through the mergers with tree farmers in Horner Waldorf, some of the mineral rights were severed from the surface rights. Mm-hmm. Andy, I've been with him several times on some of this, but Do we know where all of that went?
You know, Anaconda kept the majority of the mineral rights on the fee lands, the 650,000 acres that they sold to Champion. But then there was BN ownership, and there was Horner Waldorf for Tree Farmers ownership, and the mineral rights under those various properties really gets pretty cloudy. I know that there's just it's always a question. A lot of land that's sold and traded today is surface rights only, because no one's quite sure who owns the mineral rights. And the Anaconda holdings of mineral rights, they've transferred to all kinds of different organizations over the years. So it's pretty confusing.
I better answer that one, because that wasn't Anaconda's mineral rights at Top of Deep. Those were mining claims that came through Tree Farmers there. And so that was basically a little bit different than the Anaconda situation with mineral rights. The Pearl was one of the main claims up on Top of Deep, and that was sold when I was district operations manager at that time. So you really need to go into the kind of courthouse and take a really good look again on it. But the Top of Deep, that didn't quite get transferred the way you might think. So.
Also, I'd like to add, originally when the lands were surveyed, the people, surveyors determined whether they were mineral or not. So a lot of the lands that Champion acquired, there were some lands that said they had mineral rights on them. And so the government reserved those rights. And so people could go in and stake a claim right on Anaconda lands if and provided the original survey said they were mineral. And in this book I have up here, with the township book, when Frank Vocal mapped that book, he wrote down someplace non-mineral. So that was one of the problems we had. A lot of people thought, well, we can go mine on any of the Anaconda ground, but that wasn't true. It had to been determined it was mineral, and then the government had the rights and people could stake claims.
I think actually he wasn't supposed to buy any mineral.
Yeah,
Minerals, and they did say he walked away from it.
yeah.
But these would have come through, like, and through the tree farmers.
I was involved in a burning a section of logged over area of Lola Forest 15 years ago or something. I was just wondering, was fire used to burn slash after a logging operation in the old days as much as later days, or was it depending on the site, the situation? I realize I've only been here for 30 years, and I know it used to in the summertime have a shower in the afternoon almost every day, and I don't know, with the oncoming the large size forest fires. Anyway, how much did the fire was used in the old days was my question.
Maybe somebody could repeat that question. I couldn't. My hearing is shot, and Bob's hearing is shot. Andy, I don't know about.
Just basically, I know, like I said, personally, 15 years ago, I was involved in a slash burn after a logging operation up Lolo. It was Plum Creek property. Was fire used in the past as much as it was recently?
So the question is about fire use. Champion foresters did a lot of fire use. John Dahlberg would go out with a match and throw it in the brush and see if it would burn. Then he'd call for help if it looked good.
Yeah.
And but it was almost all, and we had such large blocks of all just fee land that if a fire got away and killed a few trees, we'd just go out and salvage them and didn't worry about it too much. and if we had to fight fire, we paid for it. You know, we didn't call the state. In fact, if the state wanted to help, Ernie Corrick would put a halt to it and tell them it's our fire, we fight it. So we did a lot of burning. I did a lot of pile burning, a lot of broadcast burning, but the liabilities with broadcast burning anymore are so high, and now the ownerships are so much different. There's so many small private ownerships out there. There's the Forest Service and the BLM are about the only organizations that still go out and actively do broadcast burning, and they spend a fortune on doing it. But for us, it was the cost of matches and a few foresters, so we got by pretty cheap.
We were cheap.
I got a question for Andy Lukes. Did Plum Creek meet that obligation of, you said $1 billion?
$1 billion. It was actually a little bit under it.
But in that, did you say 14 years that Stimson ran the
Yes,
the mill?
that original agreement was amended several different times in terms of delivery schedules and what have you. We had a really marriage-like kind of relationship. We adjusted as appropriate between the two companies there. For the record, Kent was kind of one of the major fire burners in Lolo Creek there. So. He kept a lot of us up at night with his activities.
I'd like to come back to Jim Hobbock's question. Jim, oh, there he is there. Because Jim said that sustainable forest ethics went down the toilet. Well, I was resource analyst for Champion from 1979 to 81, and then I taught the forestry ethics class in the forestry school here for about 20 years, starting in the mid-80s. And Jim, you can only say sustainable forest ethics went down if you subscribe to Gifford Pinchot's original idea that a well-managed forest should maintain an equal flow of timber year after year after year, which would mean essentially that if you're growing trees on, say, a 60-year rotation, you'd have to cut the trees over a 60-year period, or if you're growing on a 100-year rotation, you'd have to cut them over a 100-year period, so as you'd have regeneration coming in and trees ready to cut in each and every year. That was the old idea of the perfectly regulated forest. That was never subscribed to by the timber industry in the Pacific Northwest, even under the ideas of good sustainable forest management. For industry forests, sustainable forestry meant cutting the trees in such a way that you had regeneration, you had soil protection, you had good management of watershed and so on, so that the land was continuously productive. In the Pacific Northwest, starting in the 1970s, all of timber industry, or virtually all of timber industry, decided to cut all of their old growth out over about a 20-year period, which obviously means that if you're going to cut out over a 20-year period, and if you're growing on, say, a 60-year rotation, you're going to have about 40 years when you have no timber to cut. And that was a rational decision based in the Pacific Northwest, based on the idea that old-growth timber was not growing significantly. It was a significant risk from insects, disease, and fire, and there were other risks in terms of litigation and so on. So it was in terms of being able to take the money that was essentially standing on the stump and then reinvest it in other ways, for example, in pulp mills in other parts of the states, that was rational management of the capital which was tied up in the timber. Champion followed the rest of the industry in the Pacific Northwest. In 1972, when they took over the Anaconda lands, they stated quite clearly that the intent was to cut out the rest of the old growth in the Montana area on their lands in an 18-year period. The letter for that I put on the back board there, dated 1972, from U.S. Plywood to the key executives in the company. Later on, when Tony Liane mentioned the inventory that was done in 1979 when I came on, starting in 77, when I came on in 1979, it was just finished. And so we had an excellent idea of what trees were on the land. And the idea was to see how that inventory that had been done in 72, 73 shaped up. In fact, volume-wise, it shaped up very well. But that inventory done in 72, 73 had been designed and sort of honchoed by Mason, Bruce, and Gerard, the consulting company in Oregon. And they had used what they called Gerard form factors, which estimated how much of the tree would be peelable into plywood. They overestimated that. Mm-hmm. So, though they had the volume about right, they had the percentage of it that was peelable high. But the problem had been that the average diameter of the logs coming into the mill was going down over time, and so there was a strain on the peelable quantity of wood. Anyway, to cutting a long story short, it was determined about 1980 that my job, in fact, my most significant job there was to run the level of harvest study, which was designed to find out how long it would take to cut down the remaining old growth. And the answer at that time was it would last until about 1992, which was then 20 years, so 2 years longer than the original 18 that had been estimated. And that's more or less exactly what happened. The company realized in 1981 in an internal report that there was going to be a significant gap after 1992. The amount of timber, if the mills were going to keep producing at the current rate, the amount of timber that would come off company lands was going to drop from about 70% to about 18%. And so therefore there was going to be a significant gap. Either that wood would have to be bought outside on the market, or else the mills would have to start producing less wood. And that is maybe a longer answer than what you were looking for, but I think it shows you the rationale of what was carried out, and I think it's dismissive to say that sustainable forest ethics went down the toilet.
I just wanted to relate a couple of stories about Champion and how they were felt throughout northwest Montana. I managed the contract logging, trucking, and road building for a lot of years under Bob. And two short stories. The Alert helicopter in Kalispell. This is one of the most successful emergency helicopters for rescuing people in the woods in America, really. It all started on the logging jobs that Champion had in northwest Montana. One of our contractors had his son seriously injured and almost died before they could get him to the hospital in the back of a pickup. And he put the money up to buy the first Alert helicopter. And Clyde Smith was his name. Clyde logged for us for an awful lot of years. Very, very benevolent gentleman that was beneficial to the community, and we helped Clyde out in a lot of ways. Another one that happened up in Libby, one of the guys that worked in the mill, his daughter, Sally Sauer, had a bad heart and needed a heart replacement. And we took the contractors up there at Libby. Champion designated a large timber sale, and we contributed all of the proceeds from that timber sale. The loggers contributed all of their efforts. The mill tracked all those logs going through the mill. The employees at the mill contributed all their efforts, and Sally Sauer got a new heart. That was 25 years ago. I heard the other day that she had to have a second heart transplant, but she's still alive. So Champion was a real benevolent company to work for and to work with.
I'm Zuring. I just wanted to follow up on this question of Carl's, and that is, if the land is now worth more than the timber that is on it, then I sort of ask a futuristic question. You know, you sell the land, once it's sold, it's gone. If you've got trees on it, they're renewable, so you can keep getting revenue from those. I suppose the land will increase in value, but there must be a limit to that at some point anyway. So my question more is, in this area though, what does that say for timber production?
You know, it's interesting because it was something I wanted to mention. Anaconda, Champion, Stimson, Plum Creek did a tremendous amount of logging on the company lands, the fee lands that were owned by those companies. And in almost every case, we didn't hurt the land. We didn't hurt the productivity of the land. If we ever had a problem with the land afterwards, it had too many trees growing on it that needed to be thinned because our regeneration efforts were so successful. And maybe that has something to do with us as foresters and loggers, or maybe it just had to do with Mother Nature being able to recover from our efforts. Most of those lands in the Blackfoot and almost 500,000 acres of those lands in Montana, western Montana, have been saved from subdivision and development through efforts of communities, the Nature Conservancy, the Blackfoot Challenge, and so almost 500,000 acres now. Those lands are in some small private ownerships with conservation easements on them, belong to the state of Montana, DNRC or FWP, the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, and those lands will continue to produce timber into the future. And the Nature Conservancy just finished buying the remaining lands, old company lands, in the Placid Lake, Blanchard, Belmont, Gold Creek country, 117,000 acres. And they're now in the process of working with communities and organizations to determine how those lands should be used. And the reason that all these lands were protected was because of still the great wildlife values that those lands have, the great recreational opportunities those lands provided to all of western Montana, even after they've been logged for 100 years. And so, was logging sustainable in the short term, big logs? No, it probably wasn't. But the land is still there, the trees are still growing, and the values that all of us as foresters and the public hold close to us are still there. And so I think that over 100 years of forest management, we can go up, we can look and see some pretty magnificent forests that are growing today and into the future.
I got one comment here mentioned. If you recall, when Champion bought us, it was known as U.S. Plywood Champion Papers. And people, always say, was U.S. Plywood? Well, U.S. Plywood and Champion Papers merged in 1967, but they still maintained both the company names. It was later on, just after Champion bought us, that they changed their name to Champion International Corporation. So a lot of people say, well, weren't that U.S. Plywood? Well, it was, but it was just a matter of name changes. Have I got that right, Bob? That's correct. Okay. Hey, I got one story to tell. I was reading this book about the 1910 fire. I think most of you have all heard about that. And I was reading this book, and there said this Forest Service foreman, his name was Roscoe Haynes. And he was bringing a crew of men over here to take over a portion of the fire. And I'm thinking, Roscoe Haynes, now that's familiar. It's got to be the same one. Roscoe Haynes was our land agent at Bonner from about 1922 to up in the 1940s when George Neff then took his place. And I never really met the man, but I knew that Roscoe Haynes, that name had to be the same one. And I checked with some people, and everybody concurred that Roscoe had worked for the Forest Service. So it was kind of interesting to find a name like that and then put it back together where he went.
So Bob, I have an interesting thing with a guy that trespassed on our land. It was on where the Milwaukee Railroad goes over by Superior, and our land was isolated. And this guy had a land adjoining to it, and he logged our land too. So I had to go and talk to him. The guy was deaf. And I was screaming and hollering at him. He's screaming back at me. He's getting better than hell. And he said, "Oh, Roscoe Haynes told me I could log this when I got my land." Roscoe Haynes, what his name was.
All I ever heard that Roscoe Haynes was really a fine man, and people dealt with him. Except for one guy, we know who that is too, don't we, Bob? But we found out he was really a well-respected person.
Bob, you might want to mention, I know it's probably not area history, but you might want to mention about the Timberlands that Champion held in California, Oregon, and Washington. And Ernie was the regional manager, at that time. That hasn't been mentioned, so that kind of covers another area, but not our immediate local area. Thank you.
Champion owned lands in Northern California, Oregon, and Washington, and just after the merger with St. Regis, then they made Ernie the Western Operation Manager. He was in charge of all the California, Oregon, and Montana, and that's when they formed the Montana region, and it was just like the Washington and Oregon, and he was the only man that they said became vice president of Champion and never had to move. But he did an excellent job. And then he was succeeded by Blaine Bloomgren.
I guess no more questions. I guess we will adjourn. There's one little story on Ernie Corrick.
One?
Well, this pertained to the company crews. We started building joint shared roads with the Forest Service, and the company was furnishing the loggers, the road builders, and the Forest Service doing the surveying, and we ended up with real nitpicker foresters that giving us a lot of crap over some of these. We were used to building centerline and none of this cut stakes, and we could build the same quality road for half the cost. And some of these nitpickers, we had 4 different jobs. We get Al Dawson, he would go talk to Ernie Cork. Ernie would come up, look at the job, and about 2 days later, we would have a new engineer from the Forest Service. We had a job up at Gillespie Creek, and Howard Creek, and Montour, and at Lincoln, that the last nitpicker forester, he'd come up, he said, "Well, I'm being removed." And he says, I don't understand, these other foresters, they want to get along with you guys. And we said, "Well, you get along with us or you go down the road." So I guess that's about it.